myself. Break all the mirrors, don't be afraid of bad luck, 'cause it's the only kind we have here. Break all the mirrors, don't be afraid of bad news, 'cause it's the only kind we have here. It's easy to pass judgment when you're first starting to live all on your own. No, you're not alone. You're just not leaning on the wall. I am a skunk repelling everything I find, searching, not finding any shred of peace of mind. Is it courage to boldly admit to all I lack? Imagine phantom father is never coming back. Break all the mirrors, don't be afraid of bad news, 'cause it's the only kind we have here. Break all the mirrors, don't be afraid of bad luck, 'cause it's the only kind we have here.
You are listening to the show Unquestionable. I'm Dan Wu here on KZSE Santa Cruz. Thank you so much to Homebrew, my good friend Ducky on the vocals there with the track Mirrors, our wonderful, treasured theme song that I'm very grateful to get to use on this show. And I heard Ducky tell me that a few people around town have told her that they heard her on the radio, and that was really cool. And I'm grateful to the 50 years of KZSE making it so that there's an audience for people like me that really are nobodies as far as radio goes, until I come here to a place that already is so well established. Also, behind my voice is our other theme music by a much more established artist, You Make Say Think. The track is 1978. We're going to kill that in just a second, though, and welcome in our guest, Dr. Mark Stanford, who has close to 40 years working in the drug rehabilitation, psychology, and the borders of psychiatry with medically assisted drug rehabilitation techniques. How's it going this afternoon, Dr. Stanford?
Hi, Dan. Going great. Thanks for having me. And Dan, I want you to know that you are somebody in radio to a lot of us.
I hear from people that they hear the show, and it's unnerving and awesome. And also, my email is dan.woop@gmail.com. If anyone ever has show ideas, I will always look them over and see what's going on. I love to hear what's going on in the community, especially down in the San Benito County area, King City, Monterey County, east of here, southeast of here as well, because I feel I'm as guilty as anyone at this station of being very Santa Cruz centric, but our signal goes all the way down there. So I just want to get into that right off the bat. But welcome to the show, Dr. Stanford. I want to congratulate you on your retirement, which I learned about yesterday when I emailed your Janus
Yes.
of Santa Cruz email account and was slightly alarmed at the fact that it sent me back an automated message saying you retired last week. But you've been working in the field of drug rehabilitation since the early 80s.
Yes. In virtually all levels of care, from residential to outpatient to school-based, and to through what we call addiction medicine, with medicines to treat opioid use disorders. But I want to say the highlight of my career, if I can real quick, is to recognize the great work that Janus of Santa Cruz is doing. Now, I'm not plugging them in because I don't work there anymore. I don't get a 10% salesman commission. I'm just saying that they're an amazing organization, been around locally for about 40 years. They have the continuum of care from residential to outpatient to medication-assisted treatment and residential perinatal. So sometimes it's difficult to reckon with the fact that you or someone you know or a family member has a substance use disorder on any level. And so sometimes just talking about it really helps to set a course, and you feel less a victim of the mystery of addiction. And Janus is there to, I mean, that's what they do for 40 years. So I strongly recommend the audience Google Janus of Santa Cruz, and look at their webpage. Really cool.
Awesome. That was kind of where I was going to start with, was a big overarching, what was maybe the biggest nugget of wisdom that you've learned in 40 years of working with drug rehabilitation, but I appreciate you phrasing that as a highlight of your work. Going back in time to when you first got into these fields and became a psychologist and attached those skills and knowledge to specifically drug rehabilitation, how did you get into this field? What drove you in your mid-20s, as we were talking earlier, to go back to school and devote your working time in this planet that we live in to this cause?
Well, first of all, there's no more noble work than to be of service to humanity, and so I knew I was going to do something along those lines. That being said, like most people, addiction affected my family and friends. I mean, I'm a kid of the 60s, so the motto was tune in, turn on, drop out. And so no one really knew how to deal with this growing concern, public health issue. And there was very little going on in specialty care practices that dealt with substance use disorders. So that was the hook. And back in the dark ages, now by the dark ages and substance use treatment, I'm talking about the mid 80s, because this is real new stuff. We were just on a total abstinence program. In other words, you had to be ready to stop everything you thought was right for you. No drinking, no cigarette smoking, no drugs, no heroin, no methamphetamine, nothing. And I'm not kidding you, Dan.
No meth or heroin?
I know, I'm not kidding. And you had to make that decision before you came into treatment. Wouldn't that be weird if we had that admission criteria for, say, another chronic disease like diabetes or hypertension, that your doctor would say, well, you've got to stop being diabetic and then come and see me and we can treat you. It was the same dynamic. Now, I'm not bad rapping back then. It's just that we didn't know anything. There was no research about that stuff.
And it seems that through my research and just also just being a person, especially in Santa Cruz and in California, in a place that's known for pioneering a lot of these non-punitive approaches to nonviolent crime, that the 60s and 70s seems to be a big transitional sort of dead zone almost. Not even transitional, but it's after the lobotomy psych ward type of treatment method of the 30s and 40s and 50s, where they just threw you in a padded room and they're like, we don't know what to do with you. You have no willpower. And then now the 80s and 90s and beyond of this very compassionate, like, try again. Oh my God, you're back in rehab, but try again. How does it affect your view on these things growing up in that period in between those two approaches?
Yeah, it was so mind-blowing in that this cohort population of persons really affected by drug abuse started to see a switch in policy and people's perception of addiction, and started to take a more compassionate viewpoint by treatment first, not incarceration. In the 60s and 70s, the problem was too great. And what people tend to do, we don't do it so much here in Santa Cruz, but what people around the country seem to do when something happens that they don't understand, they want to isolate that problem and not think about it. That's what we did with certain ethnic groups. That's what we did with mental health and mental illness, and that's certainly what we did with drug addiction. But we've come a long way since then. It's very ironic, too, Dan, because one of the things I fondly remember of the 60s is that we were the generation that started the whole concept of social justice and equity. And yet at the same time, paradoxically, there was this chasm about how to compassionately deal with diverse populations, including people with various chronic illnesses such as schizophrenia and drug addiction. So we've come a long way. And thank God for research and the federal government. What? Yeah, I know the federal government does some things really good. What? Yeah, one of them is that they have the National Institute Institute of Health. And they fund it pretty good. And within the National Institute of Health is a really cool division called the National Institute of Drug Abuse. And I strongly recommend your listening audience to go to drugabuse.gov, drug abuse, one word, .gov, and go into publications. And there's this really cool little quick read called Drugs, Brains, and Behavior, The Science of Addiction. And you can download the PDF to your desktop or your smartphone for free. Free. You already paid for it. It's tax dollars. But it's a nice compilation, quick read of how do we know more about addiction today than we did 20, even 10 years ago? Based on what? What's the data? What's the literature? So get that book. It's really cool. Very informative.
Now that leads to the next question that popped up in front of me in a better written format than I was thinking of it, is how successful is rehab these days? How reliable is it as far as the statistics? A lot of it is self-reported.
Yeah.
Some of it is seen, as I know from people that work in the field, literally just by the people coming back in the door, the same person coming back in the door every 2 years or every 9 months. Some of those are my friends growing up in this area. Sure. Is that considered a success, the fact that they came back and that they're still maybe giving it another try? Is that seen as a failure? And how reliable is it, given the fact that a lot of the statistics are based mostly on self-reporting and voluntary interviews later on? Because a lot of people feel that rehab doesn't work, that 12-step programs are a joke, etc.
That's a great question, Dan. And there's been a lot of well-funded, really good research methodology to find out about what we call evidence-based practices. What's the evidence and who's saying it's the evidence and how do we know? So really, rather recently, they started to fund long-term studies. Now, long-term, I mean 5, 10, and 15 years. And that's about it for our industry in substance use healthcare. But no, it's not relied upon self-reporting. What we've come to understand is that we call them substance use disorders, not addiction. Words matter. And if you tell someone that they're an addict, the baggage and the shame and the stigma is horrendous, and it's actually a disincentive for going into treatment. So we look at substance use disorder. It's a chronic illness, and like other chronic illnesses, there isn't any cure necessarily, but there are longer and longer periods of remission. We apply the same outcome standard to obesity, hypertension, asthma, diabetes, that just because you saw your doctor for 28 days doesn't mean you're done with that diabetes stuff, right? No, you learn how to manage your illness to have longer and longer periods of symptoms-free living. And that's the same thing. So with addiction. So how does addiction, under the new paradigm of research-based understanding of this brain disease called substance use disorder, how does it compare to outcomes of other chronic illnesses? And it's about the same. Again, in that drugabuse.gov website, you can see outcome studies that compare chronic illnesses. And Dan, it's interesting because when I used to teach at Stanford, we saw that human responses to a chronic illness is kind of the same, whether it's alcoholism or hypertension, that initially your life becomes really uncomfortable, you're really moody, or you're sick a lot, or whatever, and then you go see a specialist and they diagnose you and they put you on a treatment plan and you start feeling pretty good. And this is human nature, whether it's diabetes or heroin use. You start to feel pretty good. And then as you start to feel pretty good, you're less rigorous in your disease management program. And then what happens? Bam! Reality hits you upside the head. Oh, I guess I still do have diabetes. Yes. So it's not a failure. It's having come to believe that, yes, I have a chronic illness that I really need to take more and more responsibility to take care of. I'm not responsible I have this diagnosis, but I'm responsible to understand it and take care of it. And by the way, footnote here, again, that Janus is really adept in helping people come to that realization and learn the skills needed to not necessarily avoid relapse, because statistically that's going to happen. But relapse is not a sign of failure. It's symptoms recurrence as it happens along the course of multiple chronic illnesses. So I've never met a doctor who said, you've failed treatment because your blood sugars are high. Get out and don't come back until you're ready. No, they all say, okay, well, let's review what happened. And let's get you back on stabilization and resume your quality of life.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that description. I want to remind listeners that you can join in the conversation by calling 831-459-4036. You can also text that number with complete words and fairly complete sentences so that if I read your text on the air, I sound smart. 831-459-4036 is that number if you have questions for Dr. Mark Stanford, who has worked almost 40 years in the substance use disorder field and just recently retired from Janus, but is a professor now at Cabrillo College, where all great teachers seem to go. It's like all dogs go to heaven. All the great teachers that want a rewarding, chill gig end up at Cabrillo. Shouts out to all of the teachers that I had that could have been getting paid more money at universities that I had when I was there. 831-459-4036. And that is kind of a question that I think has some leeway about the continuing treatment. Where do you see it? I have a lot of friends that have been involved in 12-step programs, in rehabs, all these things. A lot of them refer to rehab as a $10,000 12-step book.
Yeah.
How closely are the two related? I know AA in their literature says we're not affiliated with any programs, all of those things. How much of that is just linguistic tricks? How much of that is real? How closely related is your work in Janus to 12-step groups?
Great question, Dan. First of all, 12 steps, as important as they can be for some people, they are not treatment. Even the principles of 12-step philosophy is that treatment's really what they call an outside issue. Treatment is subjected to standards of care and evidence-based practices and research paradigms. Those are all things that are not, they're really outside of the scope of the 12 steps, which resonates with one addict helping another without parallel, period. And so 12 steps are not treatment. They can often enhance treatment, not all the time. So anybody that's sentenced, say, by a drug court or probation officer to 12 steps is really doing a great disservice because 12 steps are not treatment. I learned from one of my jobs, I was the director of Asian American Recovery Services, and it was an adolescent program, the first one in the nation, that they taught me that there are some ethnic groups where requiring them to go to a 12-step meeting and to disclose really deep personal things to a group of strangers is completely inappropriate. So you can't say that any one form of service is good for everybody. I'm for whatever works. If going to church works, if seeing your rabbi in the temple works, if going to 12-step works, if being on methadone for heroin works, great. Whatever stops you from hurting yourself.
And that's interesting that I was reminded doing this research that a lot of people equate 12-step groups with Christianity because despite the fact that the founders of AA were very skeptical of religion, they found it palatable to the people they were helping because the northeastern businessmen that they were first helping in their work happened to be Christians. So if they modeled it a little bit with the Christian touch, and I've learned that in Thailand, AA has a very strong Buddhist bent to it.
Yeah.
But if you go back further, Native Americans who were having problems with alcoholism leading to literally tribal chieftains and deputies selling off land cheap because they got drunk in a negotiation with settlers, were having meetings that looked very much like 12-step meetings 300 years ago. And how far back do the practices go that we've gone back to in the last 20 years?
The only thing I can say is that I am not an expert on 12 steps. I've been to many meetings. I do recommend them in some cases. They are not Christian. There's no advocacy towards Jesus or the Christ or anything. There's just the premise that, look, you've tried to stop this disease of alcoholism, this continued compulsive use despite adverse problems. You tried to stop on your own. It didn't work. Maybe you should just try and release that to something greater than yourself to try and help you, however you want to call that. It could be the universe. It could be this fellowship we're together. But I know enough about 12-step that it's not Christian. It does have a reference to God and a power greater than yourself. That's all.
I'm a strong believer that most different religions are just translations of other religions. So a lot of them are just basically putting it in a new language.
Yeah.
The Quran is like a software update on the Bible, which is a software update on
Absolutely.
the Torah. In my that's my view on it. If you would like to call in about drug rehabilitation techniques or your thoughts on any of what we're talking about with Dr. Mark Stanford here, 831-459-4036. And on the topic of psychiatry and drugs assisting rehab, I also want to touch on the fact that the population of drugs, not the population of people, but the population and variety of drugs around nowadays is enormous. But you also have all the classics floating around as well. You have heroin, you have cocaine, you have amphetamines in different forms. But now I have some crazy friends ordering stuff from Eastern European laboratories that were unsupervised, and people are getting addicted to all kinds of things that literally they just change a couple molecules, so it's technically legal to send through the mail for a while, but it's essentially the old drugs. How has treatment changed, and how much have you guys had to adjust your practices to involve all the other things, the alcohol, the heroin, meth, cocaine, in addition to all these new drugs that are just being invented every day?
Yeah,
do you guys have to change things?
We do have to change things because our patients and their families look to us for education and increased awareness. And Dan, let me tell you a quick story. I first became aware of this in the mid-'80s when somebody from Palo Alto tried to make Demerol. It's like codeine. They tried to make Demerol in their makeshift lab in his garage, but he didn't have any knowledge in chemical synthesis or organic chemistry. He just kind of mixed and matched. And he put this drug, which he thought was his own version of Demerol, a painkiller. And it was this really bizarre, slight, like you're saying, Dan, a slight molecule change made it something incredibly toxic. It went right to the part of the brain that controls motor movement and muscle coordination and killed brain cells there. And created essentially a Parkinsonism-like condition for people who ingested what they thought was cheap heroin. It was badly made Demerol in somebody's makeshift lab. And so the cooker, they call these self-made chemists, he didn't know what he was doing. He didn't know it was bad Demerol. They don't do clinical trials and animal studies, and they just put it out there to make a quick buck. Well, that's what we learned in the early 80s is that, oh my God, anything can go out there in the street. Somebody can just steal the basic pharmaceutical chemicals from a pharmaceutical company and go to literally a toy store and get some beakers and start to mix and match and heat up and cool down and come up with something. But is it what they say that it's supposed to be? No, we don't know. There was some bad crank methamphetamine that was coming out of Reading several years ago that caused Huntington's chorea. It's another neurodegenerative motor movement disease. We have strains of fentanyl now that we're watching, carfentanil, we're watching very closely because this little microscopic amount, it's so potent that it can be devastating in terms of fatalities. And so if they use fentanyl to lace or cut heroin or any other, Oxycontin, whatever, you don't know how much is in there. Is it too much for my body to take and I'll stop breathing and die? No one knows. So it's just Russian roulette.
Now, you mentioned two things in there that I really want to get to, is that during my lifetime, since the early to mid-'90s, there's been a huge increase in the legalization of advertising prescription drugs, and not just your doctor saying you need this, take this, but TV commercials saying your doctor hasn't even told you you need this, but you need this. And now that has resulted with, families that own some of these organizations like the Sackler family, very celebrated, wealthy pharmaceutical family, but their company was the ones that put out OxyContin. And now we have this so-called opiate epidemic where people are going and finding other alternatives, or they're getting excessive prescriptions. And how has that affected the work of places like Janus and yourself, considering that it wasn't like that in the 80s when you started? You weren't allowed to advertise for these things for different uses. You weren't allowed to just, and I don't blame the doctor. There's corrupt people in every profession.
Right.
But a lot of doctors were told that these would fix everything.
Right. Very
and it's
good
caused
point,
all these
Dan.
problems.
We call it direct-to-consumer advertising, and a lot of us were never for that. It was clearly a profit-driven. So people would see the bouncing, happy, smiley face ball, and people who were battling some serious depression would want that medication because clearly the bouncing, smiley face is happy, and I want to be happy. And so they would go with that information from that direct advertising to consumer and pester their prescribers. I want that one. I want that one. I want that. And sometimes the physicians would yield and say, okay, well, let's try it, right? So what we learned here, Dan, is just because a company says it's safe, effective, and non-addictive doesn't mean that's true.
Now, touching on the other thing that you mentioned in that last piece, what's the difference between our view of the pharmaceutical companies and these wealthy people that are celebrated for their donations, philanthropic motives and actions in our society, compared to El Chapo, who's on trial and going to prison for life for literally just facilitating the importation of drugs that people wanted because they were so hooked on the drugs that their celebrated pharmaceutical companies got them hooked on in the first place. How do you square those views of us celebrating these wealthy people here and calling it a drug kingpin in another country? Not a defense of El Chapo, by the way.
Wow, Dan, I'm not, that's not my area. But I will tell you this.
I guess I'm asking your view on
my
that.
view is that most physicians, most prescribers really are compassionate. They want to help people. Now, granted, like you said, some of them don't care. They want to bill for frequent services. But the far majority of physicians, they want to help. That's why they went into that field. They want to make a difference and help improve the quality of life.
That's the physicians themselves.
Yeah.
But on the corporate side of the people that are developing these drugs and jacking up prices, and their motive is to sell the most, I think that's more where my focus is on this frustration, let's say.
Yeah, it's profit-driven, and it's all about making sure the shareholders get their fair share. And people like you and I are going, wow, what's the fair share? And what about ethics?
Absolutely. And once again, I'm speaking with Dr. Mark Stanford, still consulting with Janus of Santa Cruz, but officially not needing to report to work every day there. He is also a professor at Cabrillo nowadays. He's about 40 years in the drug rehabilitation field. We will be back in a moment. Maybe this is the caller that left an AA meeting and wanted to join in the conversation with myself and Dr. Mark Stanford. Hello.
Hey, how are you?
Thank you so much for calling back and working with us on that.
No, of course. And I know that it's probably hard to segue back into recovery when we were just talking about what sounds like a wonderful comedy festival, but here we are.
I mean, an Irish comedy festival is alcohol related, so it's fine.
Hey, now. So I just kind of had this epiphany about the hybridity of the future of recovery and where I think recovery is going, for me at least. I had a lot of aversion to AA as a kid and growing up because my dad was a total AA, Bill W. addict. He was super into it to the point where I found it a little culty, as I'm sure many people do. I'm now going into a year's sobriety. I'll have a year on Saturday, which I'm super stoked about. And I've done it in kind of this unconventional way. I've been super quiet. I've done a lot of personal work that has nothing to do with the recovery business or whatever. But I just want to say that I found an AA meeting that did a half hour of meditation, and it was phenomenal. 6 days a week, 11 a.m., full of all people of all ages. And for me, I think in order for my recovery to work, you take a little bit of this, you take a little bit of that, you realize that your addiction issues most likely stem from PTSD and trauma, and you go from there. Like if I threw away my refuge recovery Buddhism, the Buddhist refuge recovery, which I also do, which I want to throw away right now because there's this whole Me Too scandal going on, I wouldn't have a solid sobriety practice. So I feel like the future of my recovery, and perhaps this is a macro situation as well, is in kind of combining whatever works.
Absolutely. Dr. Mark Stanford, do you have any thoughts or questions for the caller?
First of all, wow, congratulations on sustained recovery for the amount of time you have. That's awesome.
Thank you.
And like I said earlier, our only concern is that people move from compulsive continued drinking to stabilization so they can live their life on life term. However you do that, meetings, temple, church, treatment centers, whatever works. So we know that it's not a one, as you know, I'm sure, addiction or alcoholism is not a one-size-fits-all. It expresses very different from person to person. And some people need treatment intervention before they get into recovery. Some people, the severity of craving and withdrawal is so severe they might need anti-craving medication. So for an example, excuse me, opioid use disorder, sometimes medicines like Suboxone or Methadone are helpful to bring them into stabilization. But footnote, if medications are used as anti-craving to help people move into stabilization, it's only to get them to the point where they can start internalizing the principles of recovery. For without that, it's not likely they're just in and out of jails and treatment. So it's just not a one-size-fits-all. In fact, we've moved away from the term addiction and moved away from the term substance abuse. And now science has shown us that there's really substance use disorders along a continuum of severity, from mild to moderate to dependence to chronic severely relapsing. And that's important for treatment providers because we don't do a one-size-fits-all. We determine the individualized treatment based upon the subtype of the substance use disorder for the person sitting in front of us. In other words, we want the experience to be meaningful so that it can grasp the major tenets of continued sobriety. And again, I'm so awe-stricken by your time in recovery. That's just amazing.
Oh, no, thank you very much. I appreciate it. And, the whole reason that I landed in an AA meeting just a couple of days ago for the first time in a long time is because I had the urge to drink. I was doing that whole cliche, maybe I'll just have this and I'll be able to do this.
Yeah.
I was kind of chuckling to myself that I had become a cliche.
Right.
And I think what's missing in my own recovery is that community. You really do need, I speaking for myself, but I think this is also universal, we need community. We need to be able to talk to people who are going through it. And I was so pleased to be able to find this meeting that I could access where I can just sit with other people that I know what it feels like to suffer and to crave.
Thank you so much for the call.
Thank you.
And congratulations on your anniversary there. Whoa. This has been Unquestionable. I'm Dan Wu, and thank you so much to Dr. Mark Stanford for being in the studio with us.
Thank you, Dan.
Have a great day, guys. This has been Unquestionable. We're out.
Can't escape from myself. Break all the mirrors. Don't be afraid of bad luck, 'cause it's the only kind we have here. Break all the
This is the concert calendar.
Monday, March 4th, Chris Potter.